Thank you. And it's lovely to see so many of you here and from so many different places. What I want to talk about today is the issue of climate change, children and families, and the question of what intersectionality has to do with this. And since COVID-19 is such a big part of our lives, and as the other speakers have said, something that we were of course asked to think about, one of the things that's become very clear is that COVID-19 has illuminated really complex intersectional processes and made us all think about how we have to think about processes, not just about the social categories to which people belong and how they statically intersect. So as Floya Anthias in a blog this year talking about COVID-19 has pointed out, it's important to look at them in terms of intersectional processes, not just intersectional identities. In other words, to see how power, economic inequality, pay and housing, as well as racism and other forms of unequal and discriminatory treatment collide together at times in contradictory ways. So for example, we know that women have on the whole been less affected by COVID. When I say less affected, that's completely the wrong word. They've been less likely to die from COVID. But if you look at particular age groups and particular categories of women working in particular fields and so on, that picture changes, it's more complex. So we cannot just simply look at blunt categories. And exactly the same thing is said also by James Nasrou, also a sociologist, as Floya is, James Nasrou at Manchester. And he talks about the ways in which we know that there are these patterns. These patterns are complex. And he points out, for example, that Chinese women are different from other women in how they've been affected as well. So that there are always patterns you have to explain. But the point being that already the people who are suffering the most are ones we know already had problems, disadvantages because of how they're positioned in society. And in thinking about racialization, because he has a center for the dynamics of ethnicity, he asks about what is it that leads to negative racialization producing inequalities in COVID as well as other things. And I would argue very much, as I have in a blog, that COVID-19 has to be seen, as James Nasrou and Floya Anthias are pointing out, as part of society. So it didn't arise in a blank space, but it's part, I would say, of unexpected transformational conjunctions that were already going on and that are marked by intersectionality. So one of the things I point out is that there was already activism around food poverty and school hunger, way before COVID and before Marcus Rashford in the United Kingdom has brought this to government attention in a more marked way. That campaigns against the UK hostile environment were already before COVID helping us to see the inequalities for people who are migrants and for people who get caught up in hostility from the state because there is already hostility towards migrants, even if they themselves are not migrants. And this has been made worse, of course, by COVID. Then the resurgence of Black Lives Matter came into a COVID landscape, but the issues that it raises had already been evident in society. It's just they're reconfigured in new ways, and partly because of COVID and these other things that are going on. And we certainly had seen environmental activism in new ways. And environmental activism, I think, helped us also to see the world differently when COVID came along. So I'm talking particularly about school strikes and Extinction Rebellion. And we know, of course, it's a commonplace that children and women are most negatively affected by climate change, particularly those who live in the majority world, where most of the world's children live, and which is generally poorer than the minority world where fewer of the world's children live. And then there are issues of intersectionality in climate justice movements and ecofeminism. And we know that those matter because who's affected, who's able to be active, is very much differentiated by nation, age, social class, gender, and so on. So I want briefly, first of all, to talk about the ways in which intersectionality is theorized. And then I want to think about the ways in which intersectionality is central to the constraints on the agency that children can deploy in their societies. And then to move on to thinking about the ways in which it's also at the heart of the ways in which they're positioned in their families in relation to actions for climate change. And of course, I can do those things only very briefly. But to think about intersectionality, and Lynn mentioned Patricia Hill Collins at the beginning, and in her last year's book, she talks about intersectionality, which has been a fastly burgeoning theory, as an analytical tool for researching power, a way of rethinking social action and rethinking social action in itself as epistemological, that you learn about knowing, about knowledge, and you can imagine social transformation from social action. It's not a one-way process, it's an iterative process. And she talks about the way also in which power relations mutually construct social phenomena. So one of the big things about intersectionality is the social categories to which we belong mutually constitute each other. They're not simply added together. They're not additive or multiplicative, but mutually constitutive. And in a paper in the Annual Review of Sociology in 2015, Patricia Hill Collins talks about the way that intersectionality references the critical insight that race, class, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, nation, ability, and age, she could have said other things as well, operate not as unitary, mutually exclusive entities, but rather as reciprocally constructing phenomena, a knowledge project whose raison d'etre lies in its attentiveness to power relations and social inequalities. And those are also things that, of course, Kimberlé Crenshaw, who coined the term to reflect things that lots of people were particularly struggling with, and particularly Black feminists, but not only. She coined the term to recognize, as Cho, Crenshaw, and McCall say here in 2013, that these are not as categories are not as distinct, but always permeated by other categories, fluid and changing, always in the process of being created by dynamics of power. And I think that as intersectionality is developed, we're much more interested in theorizing the complexity of the dynamics of power and how we can understand that and what it means for understanding society. So power relations, absolutely key. And in the second edition of their book, Intersectionality, Patricia Hill Collins and Sioma Bilge, and the first edition only came out in 2016, the second edition came out last year, they point to these 6 core ideas of intersectionality: social inequality, power relations, the social context being crucial, relationality between categories, that we have to engage with complexity, and that there has to be a commitment to social justice, which is really fits with thinking about climate change as a social justice project as well. So overall, a knowledge project, as Hill Collins says in her new book. So moving on swiftly to thinking about the constraints on the agency that children can deploy in society. And this first picture is simply one I took walking around Stockholm and simply seeing this on a lamppost on the way to the university, asking for school strikes for climate change. Greta Tunberg, of course, and lots of children being led to boycott classes. When I say being led, I mean choosing to as well, because Greta Tunberg, from the time that she was 14 in 2017, sat in front of the Swedish Parliament demanding that her government take action. And what's key about this is that what she did was to show an accessible way that children could take collaborative local action and be taken seriously, get public attention, and do it through adult support and also gain adult support by doing it. So social action really requires that people can see ways in their own context that they can take action. So in 2019, we saw a lot of global climate change protests with school children and of course some adults, and really global around each of the inhabited continents that we saw this happening. And clearly it led to intersectional transformations. It led us to think about issues of age, nation, generation, class, racialization, and ethnicization. And I would argue it reinforced some issues around gender as well. So following Greta Tunberg's action, many more people recognize that climate change is definitely about intergenerational justice. And the way that that's been played out is different in different places and for different constituencies. There are collaborative demands from children to adults, which may have shifted some power relations. I think it's a question, but nonetheless, they've had some impact. And certainly, as Catherine Walker, who's in the audience today, suggests, it illuminated children's agency as climate justice activists. But central to an intersectional analysis is recognizing that there are differences in how children are affected around the world, but also in how they can exercise agency around the world, as Tanner, long before the present COVID-19 or the present wave of climate change activism pointed out, looking at, for example, El Salvador and the Philippines. And here I just want to give an example of Australian young people's climate change action against the state. So this is in the Nation of Change, September this year, and it's Dana Drugmund, who says this week, a group of 8 Australian teens has brought a groundbreaking new climate change lawsuit against Australia's Federal Minister for the Environment in an effort to stop a proposed coal mine expansion in the state of New South Wales. Okay, and here Laura Kerwin, who's 16, just says, you know, what she's worried about: climate anxiety. It affects her, and so on. And it's not the only case that Australian children have brought. A Melbourne law student has also brought a case against the Australian government for not doing impact assessments and disclosing them in relation to investments, climate-related risks. And in Queensland, a group called Youth Verdict also filed a lawsuit against a coal company. So the point I would make about this is that the young people who at least we see publicly in Australia doing this appear to be, and I say appear to be because I can't totally tell, but they appear to be white. They certainly are middle class or supported by middle class adults and legal workers, whether they're scholars or lawyers, and they are younger, so they're making clear generational issues. All of those things intersect, and they do so in complex ways to enable a form of activism. So I want to move on very briefly to say something about the ways in which children are positioned in their families. And I come back to Greta Tunberg and to the issue of, I mean, many of us will know that she got her parents to agree to stop eating meat and not to travel by plane. And so here, in a newspaper article, she is talking, which is actually plant-based news, she is talking about how she persuaded her parents to stop eating meat. She first of all showed them graphs, and when that didn't work, she warned them that they were stealing her future, so the intergenerational issue. And one of the things that's important about that is, first of all, note that Greta Tunberg knows a middle-class way of affecting her parents and is able to enact it. She has the means to bring graphs and data to her parents and to expect that that will influence them. But also she uses the intergenerational issue. You're stealing my future when you won't be there. And I would point out as well that as a Swedish child in a nation that takes children very seriously and childcare and prides itself on gendered and other equalities, that nation also matters. So nation, social class, the family histories, generation, and the ways in which Greta Thunberg is positioned, the things she has access to, but also her histories, and therefore what her parents feel it's important for them to do with and for her, also matter. These are complex intersections in the parental responses to her desire for climate change activism. And I want to counterpose this with an example from a book that that I did with Janet Boddy, Catherine Walker, who's, as I've said, is in the audience, Uma Venom in India, on environment in the lives of children and families in India and the UK, to make the point that parental positioning and power relations are central to imaginaries of action on climate change. And this is just one example. A white 12-year-old boy in the UK, living in an urban context, going to a state school, and his mother, talking to the interviewer, Helen Jordan, says, "What goes on in our lives every day matters to me more than what goes on in the environment. It's more important." I'm not saying that it's the environment's not important, but for me, that what goes on in our everyday lives overpowers everything else, anything else. And Nathan, her son, says quietly, "Did you know pollution can kill you?" And his mother doesn't respond to that and says, "Because that's what affects us the most." And Helen asks, "Are there any particular things in your immediate environment that affect you more than other things?" And Jordan replies, "Well, just every day, every general daily life, like making sure the kids get to school, the shopping's done, you know, it's just washing, everything, general living. That's what we have to deal with." And the point I want to make about that is that it's not that Nathan is not interested in climate change issues and doesn't know about them, but that as a working class family, that it's very different for them than for middle class families where children can become activists and have the resources to do so much more easily. And I'm not suggesting either that working class children did not and do not join, for example, the school strikes and do things for climate change, but that it's just very different for them. So to finish, intersectionality is certainly central to the constraints on the agency that children can deploy in their societies in complex ways. It's at the heart of the ways in which children are positioned in their families in relation to collaborative, whether that's intergenerational, across class, across nation, whatever, actions for climate change. And it certainly involves shifting commonalities and differences between children and families around the world. And it can help us to analyze and understand differences in power relations in climate change and climate change activism. Thank you.